All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for making the time to join us tonight. I'm Ian Kidd, and I'm just going to start us off by giving you a broad outline of what we're interested to talk about tonight, which is epistemic injustice. Now, if you have ever read any patient accounts of what it's like to be ill and what it's like to interact with healthcare systems, you will know that patients consistently report feeling that they're not taken seriously, that they're ignored, that they're dismissed, that their questions aren't taken seriously, that they can't share their experiences or make sense of their experiences in the ways that they want. And it's clear that these problems are extremely consistent. They go back a long way in time. They occur in different contexts, in different healthcare systems. And it's also clear that these experiences are being ignored, dismissed, marginalized, silenced, are causes of suffering in all sorts of ways. People don't get the care they want. They can't form trust with healthcare practitioners. And in these and many other ways, these experiences of being silenced or marginalized cause serious problems, and therefore they require investigation and correction. And a lot of excellent work by patient activists and healthcare researchers and philosophers is directed at trying to find ways to overcome these, what philosophers call epistemic problems. Now, before we introduce this concept of an epistemic injustice, it's worth looking at some of the many different reasons why these experiences of silencing and marginalization might come about. In a moment, I'll ask Louise and Eleanor to come in and offer some of their perspectives. But here's one very general reason first. It's very difficult and it's very frightening to be ill, especially if you have certain kinds of chronic illness, certain kinds of psychiatric illnesses. Being ill is scary and it's frightening and it's overwhelming. Illnesses can affect your cognitive abilities. Medications can affect your cognitive and mental abilities as well. Illnesses can ruin your memory, your concentration. Illnesses are also confusing in many different ways. Many people report that when they become ill, the world feels strange. Their body doesn't make any sense anymore. Clearly, many experiences of illness are extremely difficult to understand and describe and communicate, even before people encounter obstacles to describing their experiences. So there's one very general reason that illness is epistemically difficult. There's something about many experiences of illness that make them difficult to describe, to put into words, to communicate, and to make sense of them. So some of the causes of these problems are the illnesses themselves, but there are lots of other reasons, structural, social, and so on, which can make it very difficult to describe and communicate about illnesses. So one of them is the illness themselves, but others might be social systems, certain features of healthcare practice. And to think about some of the other reasons why illnesses can be difficult to describe, understand, and make sense of, I'm going to turn to my two excellent conversationalists this evening. And let's start with Louise. Louise, what are some of the other reasons that it might be difficult to communicate, describe, and make sense of illnesses?
Thanks, Ian. I think that there are a number of difficulties for patients involved in understanding how to fit their medical experiences within the already existing medical narratives that doctors will try to engage with them when they go to see a GP or to a specialist to find out what's really going on. Part of this can be due to medical jargon and the difficulty of translating those technical concepts or the results of tests and so on and so forth into not only a language that makes sense, but also to contextualize it in terms of how the information now is going to impact your life. But when you have some sort of medical condition that's not easily diagnosed, and some of the conditions that I'm interested in are chronic pain conditions relating to female pelvic health. Sometimes the symptoms are so general and so broad that when you go to a doctor and you try to communicate your experiences with them, you can easily fall prey to the gendered scripts that are still prevalent in medicine. So you can be told that the period pain that you're experiencing that you think is severe and debilitating is actually normal, and that this is what every other person who menstruates goes through. And it has this effect where the authority of the doctor can, in a way, not only circumvent the information that you've given them, it also has enough power to make you start engaging in self-doubting practices And over time, this is epistemically disempowering. We no longer have faith in the ability to judge our own assessment of how healthy or unhealthy our body is, how normal or abnormal our experiences are.
Yes, this is a crucial point about thinking about the silencing of the sick, because a sick person, of course, is never just a sick person. They'll be a gendered person, a racialized person, and therefore they'll be tied up in all of these other wider social systems of prejudice, oppression, and constriction. Ellie, other sources of these kinds of injustices?
Yeah, I mean, I think Louise's introduction was really nice, and it made me, some of the words that she used made me think of some of the conditions that I have been focused on in the past few years. So a lot of my work has been on what are sometimes described as medically unexplained conditions, which is not a term that is loved by everybody for a few reasons. So people say some of these conditions might be genuinely not understood, but there are also lots of systematic barriers to the uptake of the information that we do have. So, for example, in conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, long COVID, now we can also talk about in a kind of similar category. There is actually a lot of knowledge about these conditions, kind of the experience of them, but also kind of other dimensions of the illness. And there is a lot of knowledge out there, but there is another question about how and whether that knowledge gets uptake in a way that benefits patients. So turning to patient communities and other corners of research, you find that there are often a lot of resources out there. But in primary care, when you take that first step to go to a GP and say, I'm having these experiences, I don't really know what's wrong with me, that it often isn't going to be a place where you're going to be put in touch with that body of knowledge that might exist. And so turning up and saying, we don't know, our tests say there's nothing wrong with you, is incredibly disempowering. People go away and think, okay, nobody in the world understands what's wrong with me. I'm a medical mystery, and it's going to be that way until there's some mega scientific breakthrough. So I think the sort of relationship between what knowledge is out there, full stop, but also what kind of knowledge we can find and we can have access to, these interact in messy ways that can affect the experience of illness itself.
So Ellie, is there a distinction in here then between kind of two sources of these problems? So one, there could be natural problems within healthcare systems. There are limited resources for research and investigation. But then on top of that, there's also the fact, as Louise is describing, wider systems of, for example, gender depression, historical marginalization of certain groups. So these kind of two different kinds of problems.
I think the relationship between them is complicated. So from something that comes up in the epistemic injustice literature is this idea of epistemic bad luck. So there's this, in Miranda Fricker's 2007 book, there is this sort of contrasting case offered of what's a case of epistemic injustice and what's a case of just epistemic bad luck. And one of the examples she gives is about this sort of mystery illness that somebody suffers from that nobody could have known anything about, and the person can't get a diagnosis for this condition. And she says, at least in kind of this unqualified case, that this is just bad luck. There's no sort of systematic harm or injustice that's responsible for this epistemic or knowledge-related gap. And that this is something that one could say about a condition like a medically unexplained condition, something like chronic fatigue syndrome, but it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. When you look at the sort of systematic practices that are in place to influence how people can understand what's happening to them, what they are even suffering from, whether they can expect to get better at all. So I think that the relationship between these two, the just kind of the facts of life and these more kind of systematic problems and injustices, as we would say, I think the relationship is messy and complicated.
Yeah, so before we maybe go say something about this epistemic injustice. Louise, this is exactly your area of research. You've worked on hate speech, social imaginaries. This completely is your area.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that also within Fricke's book from 2007, Epistemic Injustice, she gives us the concept of a tracker prejudice. And so she's trying to distinguish cases where someone might have a bias about something really particular, you know, like scientists might not take philosophers very seriously, especially not in academic settings, for instance. That's a type of bias, but it doesn't typically follow philosophers around wherever they go. And yet there are groups within our societies who seem to find prejudice and stigma as a kind of barricade in all domains of their life. It tracks them across their social context. So, you know, from people at the bar to the people in the office to the people at the doctor's center. And also it happens across time. It's not just happening at this moment in this one day. It's happening every day as my life passes me by, and it has coherence with the experiences of other people in my group as well. And so Fricker puts this down to the power of the social imagination. And she thinks that the social imagination does a lot in explaining why it is the case that we can have these epistemic injustices of what she calls the central kind, meaning the ones that involve prejudice, in the first place, because essentially these are just stereotypes that step in as heuristics. Women are hysterical, for example. That person is crazy, in inverted commas, and therefore irrational. This person is a drug user and therefore is only drug seeking. All of these things happen really snappily in the brain, and that can sculpt the way you get a response in the medical context as well as the other contexts in your life. And that's going to be a central form of epistemic injustice for Fricker, because it's not just this one day that this one doctor says, oh, just go take some Panadol and you'll be fine. It's the systematic experience of going from doctor to friendship circles, asking for advice, asking for help, and being told consistently, no, there's nothing wrong with you. And if it's non-specified or hard to diagnose, and the science seems to back up the idea that you are perfectly fine, that in turn is going to feed into those social stereotypes in the social imagination. Women really are irrational. They really are emotional. They really are just overblown. And consequently, there is not as much epistemic uptake of our testimony.
So here then we arrive at the kind of epistemic injustice that Miranda Fricker calls a testimonial injustice. The very general idea, for those who aren't familiar with the concept, we engage in testimony. We try to give people information. And one of the main reasons we do this is we want people to do things with the information that we give them. We want to be taken seriously because we need to report our pain. We're trying to warn someone of something. We need people to understand facts about our experience. But as Louise said, you can only use your testimony to do things if people take you seriously, if people give you credibility. And prejudice, stigma will be some of the reasons that will deflate or deprive you of the credibility you need. If you're stereotyped as hysterical or as irrational, those aren't the markers of a credible person. Ellie, you've worked on particularly kind of somatic illnesses and these kind of medically unexplained conditions. How does credibility and testimony work in those cases? Because someone might protest, I am taking these patients seriously. It's just that given the nature of their conditions, ...
I think so. One of the things that interests me in particular about these sort of so-called unexplained or sometimes called boundary conditions is that they're kind of tossed like hot potatoes between somatic doctors and psychiatrists. So often people report their very debilitating physical symptoms, and they experience medical professionals looking eagle-eyed for signs of emotion dysregulation and psychiatric illness. And I mean, we are all emotionally dysregulated. Emotional dysregulation is a fact of life for all people, healthy or not, ill or not. And illness itself is dysregulating in many ways. But then how you sort of, how well emotionally regulated you seem becomes incredibly high stakes when you're in this healthcare interaction. So your emotional dysregulation, your anxiety, your worry about recovery, your worry about not being able to go to work is not just, or may not just be taken as a kind of so-called understandable reaction to adversity, but as a sign that really, you know, you're a certain type of person, you're catastrophizing, you're ruminating, you're thinking too much about your bodily processes, these kind of things. And this can really not just affect how what you say is received, but also what you choose to say in the first place, right? So there's this nice concept from Christy Dotson called testimonial smothering. So she describes this as kind of truncating one's own testimony when you anticipate that it's not going to get uptake that is good for you. So I think for these kind of unexplained conditions or boundary conditions, you often find patients turning up with a kind of set story, and they're not going to waver from the story because they know that if these messy details come into the story, then it's going to disadvantage me.
In these cases, Ellie, that might suggest that ill people then, depending on their conditions, might be in a perfect storm situation. They have illnesses which cause confusion, disorientation, memory loss, which can be worsened by the medications that they're on. And then the illnesses can also be emotionally disruptive. And famously, people are not necessarily very kind to ill persons. Is this a sort of a perfect storm situation?
Yeah, I think it can be. And I mean, so for symptoms like fatigue, like brain fog, these things can be exacerbated by so many factors, right? And stress, even just the stress of being ill, the additional stress of maybe a particularly hurtful comment, or feeling socially isolated, so not being able to immerse yourself in your hobbies and your kind of your ways of emotionally regulating, your ways of staying happy. So I think just obviously in illness you have lost your health, but if you think about just how many other things are lost in illness, the scope of it can you know affect your entire life. So, you know, not just your health, but all of the things that your health allows you to do, your sense of self, your identity, your relationships with other people, your sense of being somebody who even can be understood by somebody else. All of these things can affect not just how you sort of talk about your experience, but even what it means to you. You know, how you experience it can be so radically shaped by all of these losses, I suppose.
And Lou, you mentioned earlier the idea of concepts and understanding, which is another kind of epistemic injustice. I wonder if you can talk to that connection.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that we're not armed with, in part because we don't actually have really even a competent workforce to help us learn about it, is that we don't understand technical concepts that describe everyday ordinary experiences, right? So dysmenorrhea is the stand-in for period pain, or dyspareunia is the stand-in for painful sex. Doctors will use these medical concepts all the time as shorthand to be able to talk to each other, but it is also the language in which your health gets recorded. So if you find yourself in a position where you need to take control of your own medical records. You need to collect your own resources, your own data, and make sure that you have all of that to take it to the next physician when you need to find a new physician. Doesn't necessarily mean that you are in any better of a place to be able to understand what doctors have thought that has been going on in your body, what steps they think ought to be taken, because you're not versed in that lingua franca. And then there's the difficulty of, once one has found a kind of social script that gets your foot in the door, that might mean doing things like describing, in the case of endometriosis, having extremely awful period pain since the very moment I started menstruating, even if that's not true, right? So we'll try to sculpt our own medical narratives just to get someone to pay attention to us, right? So that we don't suffer this silencing effect of doctors going, oh, well, it's probably not a big deal. And if we had better access to concepts, if we had better access to the ongoing research that's happening in women's health, then that's not something that patients would need to do. But there was some interesting figures that came out in an Australian study recently where gynecologists and women's health GPs self-ranked their own confidence in managing patients with chronic pelvic pain. And the gynecologists were 40% confident and the GPs were 22% confident. And so if the absence of confidence in the knowledge of the specialists and the GPs is not there, how then can they pass that on to their patients? We are in a situation of epistemic disempowerment by that very fact.
So in this case, then we take a big step towards the injustice bit of epistemic injustice. One question the philosophers always ask is, well, what makes these things injustices? And we've already had good indications of what's unjust about this. People are denied credibility that they're owed. They're prevented from making sense of their experiences. But what do you think, Lou, about that sort of injustice aspect of this? I mean, why not just call these things epistemic wrongs or harms? Why use that big meaty word of an injustice?
I think the meaty word has been chosen precisely because Fricker wanted to highlight a central case of systematicity. She wanted to say there are social groups who exist that face all kinds of harms just because they are members of that group, right? They might be subject to systematic forms of violence, whether that's hate speech or whether it's physical. They might be marginalized or exploited. These are things that are typically the marks of injustices against members of groups. And her contribution is to say, you know, not only can we harm people on the epistemic register by failing to give them due credibility or failing to have a hermeneutical space, you know, a space for the development of concepts to help us understand what we're going through. Not only do we do that sporadically and occasionally, we also do it systematically, which means those same people who are disadvantaged in these other domains of life are also being disadvantaged epistemically, and taken all together, that is an injustice.
Okay, so before we can move to kind of some audience questions, so one of the things we can invite people to think about is, how exactly do we go about resisting these things? So the philosophers who want to study these things offer some advice on what to do, on counter strategies for bringing about epistemic justice. But Ellie, I mean, you've worked, for example, on the work on emotional regulation, which would point to some ways of responding to epistemic injustices. But what are some good suggestions for responding to this? I'm thinking about patient communities, work done by those who are affected by medically unexplained symptoms.
I mean, something that comes to light quite a lot in my work is just how complicated it can be to give people the right sort of space to share their experiences and develop their own interpretations. So, I mean, you've seen in this, just for example, in the chronic fatigue world, you see increasing sort of public and patient involvement initiatives, because these are sort of medical researchers are becoming aware that these are things that are going to get them grants, and it's something that you can sort of put into a project. But what you sometimes find is that patients are invited to show up to a room, they're given 10 minutes, 10 golden minutes to describe their experience, and then that's the thing that's going to make or break, you know, their liberation or not. And I think that there are obvious shortcomings with this, right? It's not just about being given 10 minutes to tell people the facts, but about systems changing in a more in a deeper way, in a richer way, and us developing better ways of soliciting detailed descriptions of what it's like to suffer from various illnesses. And in my tradition of phenomenology, this is something that, at least from a philosophical perspective, that we can try and do with this. So I think a nice way, sometimes in the work on conditions like fatigue, is to really give people space to talk about their emotions in a sort of shame-free way, and the relationship between somatic suffering, bodily suffering, and emotional suffering, because sometimes dynamics of shame can be so strong in these conditions that more sort of emotional, affective, existential dimensions don't feel that they're welcome. They're not clinically relevant, right? We want to know what your physical symptoms are, because that's the stuff that's going to make the difference in terms of medical research. And that just doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Experience more widely is rich and epistemically useful. And I think making space for all of these different dimensions of the experience to make a difference clinically, medically, I think is at least one step. I think there are many, many things that can be done, but this is one thing.
Okay, so thinking about what you've both said, then there seem several very big and very complicated sources of these epistemic injustices. So number one, we have the complexity of experiences of illness. They're confusing, they're disorientating, they change your sense of embodiment. Second, we have the changing and often uncertain status of medical knowledge. Third, we have social prejudices, stereotypes, and systems of oppression built into society. And then maybe a fourth very general factor is just the general complications of epistemic life. It's not as if making sense of your experiences and relating to people is easy at the best of times, let alone at the worst of times. So we have the kind of four very, very big sources of these epistemic problems, which points to a lot of work to do, a lot of connections to other subjects, including sociology, anthropology, also lots of need to rely upon patients themselves as activists and as members of communities, and therefore lots of things that we can discuss for the next 25 minutes. So I'll invite Anthony, if you can come in and chair us, and we look forward very much to seeing what people want to know, what people want to say, and what sense we could make of this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that conversation and for the great comments in the chat, and also for the great questions. They don't normally start coming in until about 20 minutes to the hour, so this is definitely exciting, and they're great questions. So I'll just start from the top, from Morgan. Someone mentioned gaslighting. I think that was someone in the chat, which in my opinion implies an active role from medical professionals. What role does gaslighting play in this? I mean, Morgan says in issue, I'm guessing they mean in this issue. And is this a passive or active practice? So does anyone feel like they want to jump in on that one as the first responder?
I can jump in. I'll be the brave person that dives in head first. So I'll preface it by saying that gaslighting has a lot of conceptual resonance. It's gained a lot of popularity very recently, but that doesn't mean that everybody shares the exact same interpretation of what gaslighting actually entails. So with that caveat in place, it's often reported by women with female with pelvic health complaints, that not only do their doctors not listen to them, but they also try to actively encourage them to pursue medical pathways to quote unquote remedy that don't seem to square with the testimony that you're offering the doctor. Now, in that case, they're treating you, they're doing something active, they are prescribing you a medication or a regimen or routine, and you're led to believe, on the basis of this kind of trust that we put into the medical establishment, that they really do know what's best for you, and this really is the right course of treatment, and away you go. Now, over time, if you're not getting better, but you're still going back to see doctors saying, I'm still in pain, or I'm having trouble conceiving, or insert XYZ here, and the doctors continuously keep telling you, no, you just need to try this again for a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time, to the point where you can completely undermine all of your self-confidence in your body and believe that not only is it the case that the medicine is not working or the treatment is not working, but that nothing can work. Because if the doctors say it's this and this isn't helping, well, then I'm out of options. And that, I think, can be legitimately described as a form of gaslighting, although I would hesitate to say that it's something that a doctor does intentionally, although they perhaps do it negligently. And that is definitely a form of epistemic injustice that people can experience in this context.
Great. Would either of you two, Ian and Ellie, like to pick up on that, or would you like to move on to a different question?
Just one comment on gaslighting. Louise is right to emphasize there are very different accounts what gaslighting is. On one account, that what the gaslighter is trying to do when they do it deliberately is to erode or destroy someone's sense of reality. Now, that will, of course, be a special risk, perhaps, for certain kinds of psychiatric conditions, many of which might anyway include or involve a sense of one's world kind of collapsing or deteriorating. So the badness of gaslighting might partly depend upon the nature of the condition. If you are already suffering a deteriorated sense of reality, if you are distrusting your own experiences, if you're suffering from certain kinds of complex delusional states, in that case, the effect of someone gaslighting you deliberately or not could be even more severe. So that the badness of certain kinds of epistemic injustice and the badness of different kinds of gaslighting might partly depend upon the kind of illness that one already has.
I'd just like to add that I think there are various limits of, limits of time, limits of resources, such that we may not want to say that a clinician is sort of perpetrator of an injustice on an individual level. But I think that one thing that can be useful is to exercise a sort of humility, like within the confines of what we're doing here in this time, in this space, here is what I can try and tell you about your experiences. But I mean, and linking to women's health in particular, something that Lou has worked on a lot, women's bodies are not consistent. So you may turn up for a scan, an ultrasound, an assessment or something that then is this representation of your body, but your body may do a different thing in a week's time, 2 weeks' time, in 3 weeks' time. And just having the recognition that there are various sort of limitations of the clinical encounter. And this is not intended as a sort of, comprehensive assessment of you and your body at all times, I think is something that, though we may not want to say that clinicians are perpetrators of epistemic injustices given their constraints, I think this sort of humility about what exactly the scope of the clinical encounter is for and can do is maybe part of a move towards epistemic justice.
Super. I mean, the fact that Ellie just mentioned a move towards epistemic justice, I think means we should jump straight to, I mean, in many ways, this should probably be the final question, but anyway, I'm going to go for it. It's a short question from Sasha, which is, what for each of you does epistemic justice in healthcare look like? So Ellie offered a little tidbit there. Ian, do you want to have a stab at that?
At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any consensus amongst philosophers about what epistemic justice might be. It can't simply be the absence of epistemic injustices. But at the moment, I think I would probably say something along the lines of these. Epistemic injustice would surely involve cases where all of these obstacles to the understanding and the description, the discussion of illnesses would be removed, such that the only difficulties that we do face are the ones that are, if you like, built into the illnesses themselves. Because I think that there will always be a case where certain illnesses will be difficult or impossible to describe, difficult or impossible to discuss and to communicate. Even if everyone in the world was fair and virtuous and well-informed and medical knowledge was brought to a state of perfection, many of these epistemic problems will still persist because I think they're built into the nature of these conditions. Even if everyone in the world had read Miranda Fricker and we lived in a utopian society where there were only good things, there would still be cases of confusion, disorientation, and frustration, because I think they're parts of what it means to be ill. So even if we've had a state of epistemic justice for ill persons, we shouldn't think it's a case where there would be no experiences of confusion, disorientation. I think those are probably ineradicable features of what it means to be ill, partly because it reflects the complexity of what human beings are like. Many of the experiences that we go through in life are so traumatic, so disruptive, and so shattering that they strain our abilities to understand and make sense of them. And in those cases, if you can't help people to make sense of and understand their experiences, the best you can do is to try to care for people and look after them, even if you can't fully help them to make the sense of their experiences that they want.
That's a tough act to follow. Very well said, Ian. So I feel like something that I can add at this point is when we're thinking in particular about the systematicity of tracker prejudices within the medical community, one thing that it's important to do is not only for doctors to exercise humility and for patients to be able to feel confident enough to testify truthfully to their experiences, but we have to keep paying attention to the function of social power in the social imagination. I think it's only once we start to shift the operations of the heuristics within the social imagination, those stereotypes that allow us to quickly perceive others and how much credibility we should give them or not, that's going to make a difference to how healthcare professionals can engage with patients, because we really do have norms of epistemic deference on the part of patients to put trust, implicit trust in what healthcare professionals advise them. And everybody can make a mistake, you know? And so we need to be aware that we're willing to trust what doctors tell us because of the place that doctors hold in the social imagination as it contrasts to patients. But we also need to remember that doctors are human and doctors are brought up in social contexts just like us. And doctors can also fall prey to furthering those systematic tracker prejudices within their domain of healthcare. So we have to be cognizant of that. That's the first point. We have to keep remembering it. And secondly, insofar as social change is still yet to happen, we need to try to anticipate and correct for a potential epistemic injustice that we might commit if we were not being attentive.
Okay, Ellie, you kind of started this thread with your brief comment on moving towards epistemic justice in healthcare. Would you like to finish the thread off, or are you happy to move on to another question?
Yeah, let's take another question, I think.
Cool. So there's a question by Naomi who asks, can you speak to the ways in which the failure to listen to patients and credit their accounts contributes not just to injustice towards patients, but also to clinicians and scientists' knowledge? Too often what patients say is taken to be just a surrogate for what a medical test would show rather than providing a narrative. So I'm not sure who to lob that one to, so I'll just trust someone to jump in.
So could you just repeat the second half of the question? So there was something about
Sure. So the second half is too often what patients say is taken to be just a surrogate for what a medical test would show rather than providing a narrative.
I mean, just on the topic of clinicians also being negatively affected by epistemic gaps, I think that this is a genuine problem and a big problem in many corners of medicine, in women's health, as Lou's spoken about, and also in the types of conditions that I work on, like unexplained conditions and functional conditions. So that there's been quite a few studies done on doctors' opinions about chronic fatigue syndrome, and often there is this real anxiety about diagnosing too quickly and causing iatrogenic harms. And when I present my research, when there's doctors in the audience, they often say, tell me what to do, tell me how to stop perpetuating epistemic injustices, because epistemically I feel at a loss, right? I'm kind of clutching for epistemic resources to hand to people, and I don't know what to do. So while I think kind of philosophically speaking, theoretically speaking, this speaks to quite a useful distinction between epistemic injustices and harms. So we can see a clinician as epistemically really disadvantaged by this, but not necessarily a victim of epistemic injustice in the way that the patient is. But I think there's a real, and we've seen this term moral injury coming up a little bit in amongst clinicians. So that this is the sort of idea that, so my colleague Matthew Broom in Birmingham, is a psychiatrist, wrote an article about this feeling of moral injury in the pandemic. So this, when you just can't do the right thing as a clinician, and this sort of sense of professional failure when the epistemic situation is just so dire that you are unable to fulfill your professional duty to do the right thing, and make use of knowledge that's there, or disseminate knowledge, empower patients, help patients by giving them the answers, something like this. So I think that this is a double-sided problem a lot of the time.
I will jump in to add that I think that it's definitely the case that there's a kind of frustration of healthcare professionals' attempts to give good care to their patients. And often this comes from the physicians who display some of what we would describe as epistemic virtues already. So these are the physicians who are curious and who are open-minded and who have flexibility, and they're willing to contemplate different causal explanations for the symptoms that you're currently experiencing. They're often the people who are engaged in ongoing lifelong learning as part of their roles in the profession. And yet there is still not enough research, and yet there is still not enough time, and yet one can only have so many patients on the books and thus not be able to help so many other people. And I think that the system is scaffolded in such a way as to not only disempower patients, but also to really constrain the ability of physicians to be able to change the system. So I think that it's important to recognize that patients are not the only people that experience epistemic harms. But I would also maintain, as Ellie just did, a distinction between epistemic harms, which can occur on occasion, and the injustices, which are of the more central kind.
Okay, super. So I thought there's a question that's come in from Peter, which takes the focus off the medical profession in terms of this question. So Peter asks about the role of lay advocacy groups who claim to represent patients and carers in actually contributing to epistemic injustice. He's referring specifically to the Alzheimer's Society in the UK and the Alzheimer's Association in the US, who seem to have become strongly aligned with the power of the medical and pharmaceutical establishments. Promising eventual cure is a source of power for the medical model. So does anyone want to comment on lay advocacy groups?
I think I can speak to this first, given that it's a pretty hot topic in kind of functional neurology and unexplained conditions world. And it's something that is being given increasingly more attention, I think, and there are some interesting projects underway on this topic precisely at the minute, in part in the wake of the COVID pandemic and the rise in long COVID. So one of the things that you sometimes see is this this assumption of non-recovery from certain conditions that don't have we don't have a treatment for them yet. And I mean, one genuine problem is underfunding into biomedical research into these conditions, and people are so disenfranchised, they're suffering so heavily, and because of various kind of social and economic constraints on kind of sickness benefits and so on. People are desperate for research that's going to find kind of the cause, that's going to find the virus that causes all cases of chronic fatigue syndrome, or the mechanism that gives rise to long COVID in people that have had COVID-19. And while there are reasons for this kind of group level advocacy, it can have a distorting effect on people's self-narratives, and it can eclipse features of the illness experiences, which for some people are very significant. And then often one of the things that you can see reported is this sense of trade-off between kind of social isolation and sort of being faithful to the complexity of your own experience and how you communicate it to other people. So I think that, I mean, I don't know much about the Alzheimer's Society case, but I think there are parallels here based on what you described, this real commitment to pharmacological interventions in a way that can maybe sometimes eclipse the complexities of the lived experience to the detriment of how people come to understand themselves. And I mean, it depends also on your social setting and how kind of, I don't like this term, but medically literate you are. So if you've got these symptoms and the only, you go on Google and you just see newspaper articles about your condition, and it just seems like completely hopeless. If this is your first port of call and this is the information that you're exposed to, this can radically change how you understand what's happening to yourself, which, in some cases can change what happens to you if you're so anxious about non-recovery that you completely change your lifestyle in a way that may or may not be helpful to you. Then that the harms of this can just be unquantifiable, really. So I think that to loop back to the question, yeah, I think that this at least in some conditions is a real problem to be aware of, and understanding these dynamics will need to be part of giving so-called epistemic justice to various patient groups.
I might jump in as well quickly, just to say that there's been a lot of activism in Australia over the past few years to raise the profile of endometriosis, as it were, to show that it is understudied, that far more women experience it than previously thought. New Australian estimates put it at 1 in 7 women, and formerly it was thought to be 1 in 10. And this has had a knock-on effect, right? It has meant that there is more funding than there was. Activists argue that it's still not sufficient funding, but nonetheless, there is more than there was. There is action. There are clinics being set up. But with that comes not only the eclipse of other kinds of female pelvic pain that you might experience, and also there's a framing that tends to go along with why endometriosis is important. And that framing is typically that it affects your fertility. So if fertility is something that you're not particularly concerned about, say your major concern is pain, and the money is pushing the medical research that finds out how to keep you fertile, not how to prevent your pain experiences, then the advocacy, whilst doing something for some people, is certainly not capturing the totality of what this diverse cohort of people need.
Super. Well, we have time for just one last question. I mean, I'm sorry to all the people. I'll just say Sam, Sophie, Bill, and Ellie, 1 anonymous attendee, 2 anonymous attendees, Joanna, Lourdes. You've all asked really great questions. And if we went on for 90 minutes, we would love to extend the conversation. I'm sure that our speakers, if they would like to be contacted, can put their email address in the chat. But I thought I'd end with a final question and just address it to Ian to sort of bring the circle round. So the question is from an anonymous attendee and says, could you clarify why it is that the epistemic gaps experienced by patients are injustices, but those experienced by medical professionals are not? It's quite an interesting question, and possibly one that I don't know the answer to, so I'm biased to ask it.
Thank you, Anonymous. I'd say 2 things in response to this. First, there will be lots and lots of reasons why epistemic gaps open up, and lots of reasons epistemic gaps remain open over time. Epistemic injustices will be one of them. Sexist stereotypes will be another. Entrenched racism, gaps in medical knowledge. There'll be lots of reasons that gaps open up, and only some of those gaps would be fully explained by reference to unjust social histories. There can be, as it were, kind of morally neutral reasons why gaps open up. Second, I think I would want to say that it's not just ill persons who will experience epistemic injustices. Looking at the wider literature, at least in philosophy, epistemic injustice is a pervasive feature of the social world. I mean, which people experience epistemic injustices, how often they experience them, how bad their epistemic injustices are for them, that varies enormously. But doctors and healthcare practitioners of other kinds can be victims of epistemic injustices too. What we will probably see in many cases is a complex overlapping web of epistemic injustices. The ones that we've been mainly concerned about here are the epistemic injustices experienced by patients, but healthcare practitioners themselves will be subject to different kinds of epistemic injustices. For example, all healthcare systems have hierarchies. I worked in a hospital many years ago as a hospital porter. I had a very acute sense. I was at the absolute bottom of a hierarchy, and the consultants and the doctors were at the top. Wherever there are human beings, there will be hierarchies and injustices. So I wouldn't want to suggest that it's only patients who experience them. Epistemic injustice will be a general feature of the world. And one very difficult problem when you think about epistemic injustices in healthcare is trying to map out these different epistemic injustices. So it's not just the patients whose epistemic gaps would count as epistemic injustices. There's a whole overlapping structure of epistemic injustices, which is a gloomy thought to end on, I'm afraid. But I think this partly captures some deep truth about our social world. The social world is deeply epistemically unjust for all sorts of reasons, through accident, through deliberate actions, through entrenched systems of oppression due to the imperfections of human life. Epistemic injustices are a big feature of the world. Now, that's not to say there's nothing that we can do about it. There's an enormous amount we can do about it. And in an hour, we can only scratch the surface here. But that's what I would say in response to that one.